Captain Jake Morrison walked through the long hallway that led to the Galactic Council chambers, and his boots made soft sounds on the metal floor that stretched ahead of him like a silver river under the bright lights that hung from the ceiling. Above him, and he could feel the weight of 3 years pressing down on his shoulders like a heavy blanket made of frustration and anger that he had been forced to swallow day after day while watching his people bow their heads to aliens who treated them like children who had just learned to walk. The council building rose up around him like a mountain made of glass and steel, and inside its walls lived the 12 species that ruled this part of the galaxy, with iron fists hidden inside silk. Gloves and each of these species looked at humans the way a teacher might look at a student who could not read simple words or solve easy math problems. And this look had become as familiar to Jake as his own reflection in the mirror each morning, when he put on his uniform and prepared for another day of diplomatic humiliation. The Velkari were the worst of all the council species, and they looked like giant snakes that could stand up and walk on 2 legs, and their leader was named Counselor, Sithak, who spoke to humans the way someone might speak to a pet dog that had learned a new trick, and his voice always carried the sound of someone who was bored and tired and wished he could be doing something more important than talking to. Primitive creatures from a small blue planet on the edge of nowhere. Ambassador Lisa Hayes had spent more time in these halls than any other human, and she had listened to thousands of hours of lectures about how young and violent and stupid the human race was compared to the wise and ancient civilizations that made up the council, and she had nodded and smiled and said thank you, even when the aliens told her that humans were barely smart enough to fly ships between stars without crashing into things and killing themselves. The Nexari were the military power of the council, and they were made of living crystal that could think and move and fight, and they believed that strength was the only thing that mattered in the universe, and they saw humans as weak, soft creatures who would break apart like glass if anyone hit them too hard, and their ships patrolled the space around human worlds like sharks swimming around a small boat full of helpless people. The Zephyrians controlled all the trade in this part of the galaxy, and they were made of gas and light that could take any shape they wanted, and they had put heavy taxes on everything humans wanted to buy or sell, and they made human merchants wait for weeks or months to get permission to trade with other worlds, and they acted like they were doing humans a great favor by allowing them to participate in galactic commerce. At all, for 3 long years, humans had accepted all of this treatment with patience and politeness and diplomatic smiles that hid their true feelings like masks worn by actors in a play. And every human captain who had been forced to submit to degrading inspections had gritted their teeth and followed orders, and every human diplomat who had been lectured like a child had nodded respectfully and thanked their alien teachers for their wisdom and guidance. But Jake Morrison knew that something had changed in the last few days because he had received a message from Admiral Ben Carter that was short and simple and contained words that made his heart beat faster and his hands shake with anticipation, and the message said that Operation Courtesy Protocol had been officially terminated and all human ships and crews were now authorized to respond to hostile actions with appropriate force. The council chamber doors opened in front of Jake, and he could see the circular room where the 12 species sat on raised platforms that looked down on the center floor, where humans always stood when they came to ask for permission or beg for mercy or accept punishment for crimes they had not committed, and the walls were covered with symbols and writing in languages that humans had been forced to learn so they could understand the laws and rules that govern their lives. Counselor Sithak moved across his platform like water flowing over rocks, and his voice filled the chamber with the same tired boredom that Jake had heard so many times before, and he said that the humans would now present their petition for expanded mining rights in the Kepler sector, and that the council would need to review their primitive techniques before granting even limited access to the asteroid fields where valuable metals waited to be harvested. Jake Morrison stepped forward into the center of the chamber, and he could feel the eyes of all 12 species looking down at him like judges preparing to sentence a criminal. And for 3 years he would have bowed his head and spoken in a soft, respectful voice, and used words like please and thank you, and if it pleases the council. But today was different, and today he stood straight and tall and looked directly into the alien faces that surrounded him. When he opened his mouth to speak, his voice was clear and strong, and carried none of the humble deference that the council had come to expect from humans. And the words that came out made the chamber fall silent like a library where someone had just shouted a curse word, and every alien delegate felt something cold and dangerous creep into their hearts like ice water flowing through their veins. 3 days before Jake Morrison walked into the council chambers, a human mining ship called the New Denver was working in the asteroid belt of the Kepler sector, where Captain Ron Blake and his crew of 43 men and women were pulling valuable metals from rocks that had been floating in space since before life began on any planet, and they were following all the rules and regulations that the Council had written for human operations, which meant they worked slowly and carefully and reported everything they did to the alien authorities, who watched them like prison guards watching dangerous criminals. Captain Blake was a good man who had spent 15 years flying cargo ships between human colonies, and he had learned long ago that the best way to deal with council inspections was to smile and nod and answer all questions with yes, sir, and no, sir, and thank you for your patience. And he had taught his crew to do the same because fighting with the aliens only made things worse for everyone, and the council had ways of making life very difficult for humans who caused trouble. The New Denver was not a beautiful ship, and it was not fast or powerful, but it was sturdy and reliable, and it had all the equipment needed to break apart asteroids and sort the valuable materials from the worthless rock, and the crew worked in shifts around the clock because mining was hard, dangerous work that required constant attention, and one small mistake could kill everyone on board, or send the ship spinning away into the darkness between stars. When the Nexari patrol fleet appeared on their sensors, Captain Blake immediately followed protocol and powered down all weapon systems and stopped all mining operations and sent a message to the lead ship requesting permission to continue their legal and authorized work in the sector, and he used all the proper forms of address and respectful language that the council required when humans spoke to their betters, and he waited patiently for a response while his crew gathered in the common area and prepared for another humiliating inspection. The Nexari ships were beautiful and deadly things that looked like they had been carved from single pieces of living crystal, and they moved through space with a grace that human ships could never match, and their weapons could turn a mining vessel like the New Denver into a cloud of glowing particles in less than a second, and everyone on the human ship knew this and felt the fear that came with being completely helpless in the face of superior force. Commander Courteous was the leader of the Nexari patrol, and he was made of clear crystal that refracted light into rainbow patterns across his body, and his voice sounded like music played on bells made of ice. And when he spoke to Captain Blake, his words carried the same casual contempt that all council species used when addressing humans. And he announced that the New Denver would be boarded and inspected for violations of mining regulations and contraband materials. The inspection began normally with Nexari security teams moving through the ship and examining equipment and checking manifests and asking questions about mining procedures, and Captain Blake and his crew answered everything politely and completely, and provided access to all areas of the ship, and offered refreshments to their alien visitors, even though the Nexari did not eat or drink anything that humans could provide. But after the first hour, Commander Courteous began to change the nature of the inspection, and he ordered his teams to tear apart crew quarters and personal belongings, and he made human workers kneel on the floor while Nexari soldiers searched through their private possessions and threw clothing and photographs and letters from home onto the deck like garbage. And when Chief Engineer Amy Rodriguez asked why this was necessary, Courteous struck her across the face with a crystal hand that left cuts on her cheek. The humiliation continued for 3 hours, while the Nexari troops destroyed everything they touched and made crude jokes about human weakness and human stupidity and human ugliness, and they forced the crew to clean up the mess, while alien soldiers stood over them with weapons drawn, and Captain Blake watched his people suffer and knew that any protest would only make things worse for everyone, and so he gritted his teeth and remained silent. When the inspection finally ended, Commander Courteous stood in the middle of the destroyed common area and looked at the human crew with disgust written across his crystal features, and he told Captain Blake that humans were soft, weak creatures who had no business pretending to be minors in space, and that perhaps the Nexari should confiscate the New Denver to prevent any accidents that might happen when primitive beings tried to use technology. They did not understand. Chief Engineer Amy Rodriguez had been recording everything that happened during the inspection using a small device hidden in her uniform, and the footage showed every moment of cruelty and humiliation that the crew had endured, and within 6 hours of the Nexari departure, the recording was transmitted to Earth through the quantum communication network that connected all human colonies and settlements. Admiral Ben Carter received the footage while he was attending a meeting with the Joint Chiefs of Staff in the Underground Command Center beneath the Rocky Mountains, and when he watched Nexari soldiers destroying the personal belongings of human miners and striking a human woman for asking a simple question, his face turned red with anger, and his hands clenched into fists, and he stood up from his chair and told his staff to begin immediate implementation of Operation Courtesy Protocol Termination. The orders went out to every human ship and station and colony in the galaxy, and the message was simple and clear and had been waiting in sealed files for 3 years, while humanity endured insults and restrictions and degrading treatment from aliens who believed they were superior to the species that had created art and music and literature, while the Council races were still learning to make fire. Alarms began screaming throughout the council station like wounded animals crying for help, and the sound filled every corridor and chamber and office with a noise that made alien hearts beat faster and alien minds race with fear and confusion, while emergency lights flashed red and yellow warnings across walls and ceilings and floors, and the voice of Admiral Ben Carter echoed through every communication system in the sector like thunder rolling across a stormy sky. Admiral Carter sat in the command center of his flagship, which was hidden in the shadow of a dead moon 3 light years away from the council station, and his voice was calm and steady as he spoke to billions of beings across hundreds of worlds and told them that the time for pretending was over and that humanity would no longer accept insults and restrictions and degrading treatment from species who had mistaken politeness for weakness and courtesy for fear. The tactical displays around the council chamber began to shift and change as sensors detected energy signatures that had been invisible just moments before, and what they revealed sent waves of shock and terror through the assembled delegates. Because where the Council had believed there were perhaps 50 human vessels scattered across the sector, there were now over 3,000 ships of every size and class and purpose, and they were all moving into position with the precision of a symphony orchestra playing a song of war. Captain Jenny Price commanded the dreadnought Iron Eagle, which was larger than any ship the Council had ever built, and its hull was covered with weapons that could destroy planets, and its engines could move it faster than any Nexari cruiser, and its shields could deflect the combined firepower of an entire alien fleet, and it had been hiding in normal space just outside sensor range for 2 years, while its crew waited patiently for orders that they knew would eventually come. The Nexari patrol ships that had been cruising through the sector with arrogant confidence suddenly found themselves surrounded by human vessels that appeared from nowhere like ghosts materializing in a haunted house, and the crystalline warriors who had always believed themselves to be the ultimate military force in the galaxy now looked like children playing with toys, while adults brought real weapons to the playground. Stealth frigates decloaked next to council stations and revealed hull designs that were unlike anything in the alien databases, and their sensor profiles showed technology that was decades ahead of what the Council believed humans possessed, and their weapon systems were already locked onto vital systems and command centers and communication, arrays and power generators and life support facilities. Heavy cruisers dropped out of hyperspace in perfect formation around Council military bases, and their captains sent polite messages requesting immediate surrender and withdrawal to minimum. Safe distance, and the tone of these messages was respectful and professional, but the meaning was clear as starlight and sharp as broken glass, because the humans were no longer asking for permission or begging for mercy. Fighter squadrons launched from carriers that materialized like dreams becoming reality, and the small, fast ships moved through space with deadly grace, while their pilots sang old Earth songs over the communication channels and laughed with joy at finally being able to show their true skills after years of pretending to be slow and clumsy and incompetent when flying near alien observers on the mining ship New Denver. Captain Ron Blake stood on his bridge and watched through the main view screen as the same Nexari patrol fleet that had humiliated his crew just 3 days earlier now fled at maximum speed toward the safety of Council space, while human warships followed them like wolves chasing frightened sheep. And Blake smiled for the first time in months, and told his crew that justice was finally coming for those who had treated them like animals. Commander Steve Parker brought his stealth frigate Silent Hunter to within 50 meters of the Council Station Command Center, and his ship decloaked, with a flash of light that temporarily blinded the sensors. And when the alien technicians could see again, they found themselves staring at weapons that were pointed directly at their most vital systems. And Parker announced that his orders were to ensure the safety of human diplomatic personnel during the upcoming negotiations. The Council delegates sat in their chamber and watched their military forces retreat in panic while human ships took control of every strategic position in the sector. And the aliens began to understand that everything they thought they knew about humanity had been carefully constructed lies designed to hide the truth until the moment when revelation would have maximum impact and psychological effect. Dr. Helen Grant had planned this psychological warfare campaign from her office on Earth, and she had studied alien minds and alien fears and alien weaknesses for years, while developing strategies that would break enemy morale without requiring unnecessary bloodshed, and her reports had recommended allowing the Council to believe they were superior until the moment when that belief could be shattered like glass hitting concrete. Ambassador Lisa Hayes stood in the Council chamber and looked up at the alien delegates who had spent 3 years lecturing her about human inferiority and primitive nature and violent tendencies, and she could see fear growing in their eyes like darkness spreading across a clear sky. And she knew that the balance of power in the galaxy had just shifted forever, and that the age of human submission was ending while the age of human equality was beginning with fire and steel. Chaos erupted in the Council chamber like a volcano exploding after centuries of quiet sleep, and alien delegates jumped from their seats and shouted questions in dozens of languages, while their translators worked frantically to keep up with the flood of panic and confusion and anger that filled the air like smoke from a burning building, and the Zephyrian trade representative named Mist Ara flickered between different gaseous forms, as her species did when experiencing extreme stress or fear. The crystalline Nexari military commander, who had been standing at attention beside his counselor, began to shake with vibrations that sounded like wind chimes being struck by a hurricane, and his voice cracked like breaking glass when he tried to speak into his communication device to contact his fleets and coordinate a response to the human ships that had appeared from nowhere, like magic tricks performed by a master illusionist. Counselor Sithak slithered back and forth across his platform, while his serpentine body coiled and uncoiled with nervous energy, and his hood flared wide with colors that indicated extreme agitation and confusion, and he hissed questions at his advisors who had no answers to give him because their intelligence networks had completely failed to detect the true extent of human military capabilities and technological advancement. Commander Steve Parker appeared on the main display screen in the center of the chamber, and his image was crystal clear and his voice was calm and professional, when he explained that his stealth frigate was currently positioned just 50 meters from the Council Station Command Center, with weapons armed and targeting systems locked onto critical infrastructure and life support systems, and he wanted everyone to know that any hostile action would result in immediate and overwhelming retaliation. The Zephyrian delegate Miss Ara was the first to recover enough composure to speak coherently, and her gaseous form solidified into something resembling a humanoid shape as she demanded to know how the humans had managed to hide such a massive fleet from the most advanced sensor networks in the galaxy, and her voice carried undertones of fear that made her words sound like whispers in a graveyard. Parker smiled on the display screen, and his expression was friendly and patient, like a teacher explaining simple mathematics to confused students. And he told the assembled aliens that the answer was actually quite obvious once someone understood the true nature of human psychology and strategic thinking and planning capabilities and long-term patience when pursuing important goals. The truth was devastating in its elegant simplicity. Because humanity had encountered Council scout ships decades before the official first contact event that the aliens believed marked the beginning of their relationship, and instead of revealing themselves immediately, the humans had studied their potential neighbors with the thoroughness of scientists examining dangerous bacteria under microscopes. Dr. Helen Grant had been a young xenopsychologist when the first Council ships entered human space, and she had convinced the government to authorize a massive intelligence-gathering operation that would map alien territories and study alien cultures and identify alien weaknesses and strengths before making any direct contact. And her recommendations had shaped human policy for an entire generation. The deception had required incredible discipline and coordination because every human ship that entered Council space had to maintain the illusion of primitive technology and limited capabilities while secretly gathering intelligence and mapping defensive positions and studying alien military tactics and procedures and communication protocols and supply lines. Human engineers had reverse-engineered Council technology while pretending to struggle with basic concepts, and human scientists had solved alien mathematical problems while acting confused by simple equations, and human diplomats had memorized every detail of alien psychology while pretending to be impressed by their wisdom and superiority. Ambassador Lisa Hayes looked up at the Velkari counselor, who had spent 3 years treating her like an ignorant child, and she could see the growing understanding in his alien eyes as he began to realize that every conversation and every lecture and every condescending explanation had been carefully recorded and analyzed and used to build detailed psychological profiles of every Council species. The humans had learned that the Velkari valued intellectual superiority above all else, and believed that younger species should defer to their ancient wisdom, and the Nexari respected only military strength and despised any sign of weakness or submission, and the Zephyrians saw everything in terms of profit and loss and trade advantages and market control. This knowledge had allowed human agents to manipulate Council perceptions by showing exactly the behavior that would reinforce alien assumptions about human nature and capabilities, and the Council had seen what they expected to see because humans had carefully crafted every interaction to confirm alien prejudices and preconceptions. Captain Jake Morrison stood in the center of the chamber and watched alien faces change from confusion to fear to dawning comprehension as they began to understand the scope of the deception that had been practiced against them. And he could see them realizing that every restriction and every insult and every degrading inspection had been carefully noted and remembered and would now be answered with interest. The Velkari. Counselor Sheathok finally found his voice and asked the question that every alien in the chamber was thinking, and his words came out like a whisper because he was afraid of the answer, and he wanted to know what the humans planned to do with their revealed military superiority and technological advancement. Morrison looked directly at the serpentine alien who had lectured him so many times about human inferiority and primitive nature, and his voice was calm and steady when he gave his answer. and said that humanity wanted justice for 3 years of humiliation and degradation and systematic oppression disguised as benevolent guidance from superior civilizations. The next 72 hours changed the political landscape of the galaxy like an earthquake, changing the shape of mountains, and human fleets moved with the precision of clockwork mechanisms that had been designed by master engineers, and every target was hit at exactly the right moment with exactly the right amount of force, while alien defenders scrambled to respond to attacks that came from directions they had never considered and speeds they had never imagined possible. Colonel Dan Hughes led the assault on the primary Nexari military shipyard, which was a massive crystalline structure that orbited their home world like a second moon and had been building warships for over 1,000 years without ever facing a serious threat from any enemy force, and the facility was protected by energy shields and automated defense systems and a garrison of 10,000 Nexari warriors who considered themselves the ultimate military force in the galaxy. The human attack began with stealth bombers that materialized inside the shipyard perimeter like ghosts walking through walls, and their weapons destroyed key defensive positions with surgical precision, while marine assault ships landed on docking platforms and disgorged soldiers who moved through the facility corridors with tactical efficiency that made the crystalline defenders look like children playing war games with toy weapons. Hughes himself led the main assault force through the command center, where Nexari officers tried to coordinate a defense that was doomed from the moment it began, because human intelligence had mapped every corridor and identified every weak point and planned countermeasures for every possible response, and the crystal beings found themselves fighting an enemy that seemed to know their thoughts before they could think. The Commander Courteous was the same Nexari officer who had humiliated the crew of the New Denver just days earlier, and he now found himself kneeling on his own command deck while human Marines pointed weapons at his crystal body, and Hughes stood over him with a smile that was cold as winter starlight and asked if the alien commander would like to experience the same treatment he had given to human miners. Meanwhile, Captain Lucy Chang commanded the engineering corps that was systematically dismantling the trade barriers and economic restrictions that had strangled human commerce for 3 years, and her ships surrounded Zephyrian trade stations while her teams took control of customs facilities and taxation centers and shipping manifests and cargo inspection protocols. The Zephyrian trade representatives who had imposed crushing tariffs on human goods and forced human merchants to wait months for trading permits now watched their monopolies crumble like sandcastles being washed away by ocean waves, and Chang announced over the station communication systems that all discriminatory practices were ended immediately, and that future commerce would operate on principles of equality and fair competition. Captain Pete Maxwell commanded the ship Justice served, and his mission was to track down every council vessel that had conducted degrading inspections of human ships over the past 3 years, and his crew had spent months compiling a list of alien captains and commanders who had humiliated human crews, and now each of these beings would face the same treatment they had once dispensed with such casual cruelty. The Valkyrie captain, who had once forced human miners to scrub the floors of his vessel while his crew laughed and made jokes about human weakness, now found himself on his knees cleaning the deck of a human ship, while Maxwell stood over him and explained that this was what justice looked like and that dignity was something that all beings deserved regardless of their species or technological capabilities. In the Kepler sector where the original incident had occurred, Captain Ron Blake watched from the bridge of the New Denver as Nexari patrol ships that had once ruled this space like feudal lords now fled before advancing human warships, and his crew cheered when they saw the alien vessels that had terrorized human miners for years now running away like frightened animals. The psychological impact of these reversals was devastating to Council morale because the alien species had never experienced the helplessness and humiliation that they had routinely inflicted on humans, and They began to understand what it felt like to be on the receiving end of superior force, used without mercy or consideration for the dignity of the defeated. Admiral Ben Carter coordinated the entire operation from his flagship while monitoring reports from dozens of battle groups and strike forces, and he was careful to ensure that human forces used only the minimum necessary violence to achieve their objectives, because the goal was not genocide or conquest, but justice and recognition of human equality in galactic affairs. The most important battles were not fought with weapons, but with communication systems, as human hackers penetrated council networks and broadcast footage of alien cruelty and human restraint to every world in the sector, and billions of beings who had been oppressed by the council system began to see that change was possible and that the old order could be challenged and defeated. Within 3 days, the entire council military structure had collapsed, like a house made of cards being blown over by a strong wind, and alien commanders who had never experienced defeat found themselves signing surrender documents while human officers treated them with the professional courtesy that had been denied. To human prisoners and crews, the message was clear to every species in the galaxy, and it said that human patience was not human weakness, and that human courtesy was not human submission, and that the time for treating any species as inferior beings was over forever, and that the future would be built on principles of mutual respect and equality rather than domination and exploitation. 6 months after the galaxy learned what happened when humanity switched off its courteous mode, the political landscape had transformed so completely that historians would mark this period as the end of one age and the beginning of another, and the Galactic Council still existed, but now it was a very different organization that operated on principles of equality and mutual respect rather than domination and condescension. And Rear Admiral Ben Carter stood on the observation deck of his flagship Terra's Fury and watched through the transparent aluminum windows as the formal signing ceremony took place on the rebuilt council station, and the document being signed was not just a peace treaty, but a complete restructuring of galactic civilization called the Charter of Equals, and it established fundamental rights for all species regardless of their technological development or military capabilities or physical appearance. The Charter guaranteed the right to self-determination for every species and the right to fair trade without discriminatory taxes or arbitrary restrictions, and most importantly, the right to be treated with dignity and respect by all other members of the galactic community, and it included enforcement mechanisms that would prevent any species from ever again using superior technology or military force to oppress or humiliate their neighbors. Ambassador Lisa Hayes had been promoted to Secretary General of the Reformed Council, and she now presided over sessions where representatives from dozens of minor species took their seats for the first time in galactic history, and these beings had been ignored or oppressed by the old system, but now they had voices and votes and the power to shape their own destinies. The ceremony hall was filled with delegates from over 200 species, and many of them were meeting each other for the first time, because the old council had strictly controlled which species were allowed to participate in galactic affairs, and had kept many civilizations isolated and dependent on the major powers for trade and technology and communication with the wider galaxy. Captain Jake Morrison had been promoted to Admiral after his confrontation with the Council 6 months earlier, and he now served as the human representative on the Military Oversight Committee that was responsible for ensuring that no species could ever again build the kind of military dominance that the Council had once enjoyed, and that force would only be used to protect the innocent and maintain peace. The former Velkari counselor Sithak approached Morrison after the ceremony, and his serpentine body moved with a humility that would have been impossible to imagine during the years when he had treated humans like primitive children, and he admitted that humanity had taught the galaxy what true strength looked like, and explained that real strength was not the power to dominate others, but the wisdom to choose mercy over vengeance. Morrison nodded, but his expression remained serious, and he told the alien that humans had not forgotten the years of humiliation and degradation they had endured, and that the courtesy protocol could be reinstated if it ever became necessary, but that it could also be switched off again if any species made the mistake of confusing human restraint with human weakness. The Nexari military had been completely reorganized under human supervision, and Commander Quarth now served as a junior officer in a mixed-species patrol force that was dedicated to protecting trade routes and preventing piracy, and his crystal body still bore the scars from his encounter with human marines. And he had learned to treat all species with the respect that he had once reserved only for other Nexari. Captain Lucy Chang had been appointed as the director of the new Galactic Trade Commission, which regulated commerce throughout the sector and ensured that no species could use economic pressure to coerce or control their neighbors, and the Zephyrian trade representatives who had once imposed crushing tariffs on human goods now worked under her supervision and followed rules that applied equally to all civilizations. Most profound change was in the attitudes and beliefs of billions of beings throughout the galaxy who had witnessed the transformation of human status from oppressed minorities to equal partners and leaders, and they began to understand that technological superiority did not grant moral authority, and that military power did not justify cruelty or exploitation. Captain Pete Maxwell continued to command the Justice Served, but his mission had changed from seeking revenge against specific individuals to ensuring that the principles of the Charter of Equals were enforced throughout human space and beyond, and his ship served as a symbol of the new order where justice was dispensed fairly and without regard to species or political power. Dr. Helen Grant published her analysis of the psychological warfare campaign that had made the human victory possible, and her work became required reading at military academies throughout the galaxy, and young officers of every species studied her methods, and learned that the most effective weapons were often patience and planning, and careful observation rather than brute force and superior technology. The archives of human military intelligence contained detailed records of every insult and every humiliation, and every act of cruelty that had been inflicted on human personnel during the 3 years of the Courtesy Protocol, and these records served as a reminder that injustice would always be remembered, and that those who chose to abuse their power would eventually face consequences for their actions. As representatives returned to their home worlds to implement the new galactic order, humanity had achieved something that no other species in the galaxy had ever accomplished, and they had used their superior military technology not to conquer or enslave their former oppressors, but to create a more just and equitable system that protected the rights and dignity of all civilizations. The age of condescending benevolence was over, and the age of genuine cooperation had begun. And in the deepest vaults of human command centers, a simple note was filed that read, "Operation Courtesy Protocol mission accomplished, and new objective ensure it never needs to be reactivated." And every human leader understood that their greatest victory was not the defeat of their enemies, but the creation of a galaxy where such enemies would never need to exist again.